Well, today we reach the climax of the book of Hebrews. Throughout the book, the Hebrew preacher has been explaining all these metaphors, images of Jesus, and all of that for the 3 verses we're going to read today. So with that being said, I'd like to share 3 images with you. It was May, and I had just finished college for the summer. I was excited with some friends, and we could not wait to get up into the mountains. 2 other trek guides and I decided we were going to hike a 14er in May. Now, for those of you who live here in May, you laugh because it's still winter up in the mountains in May. But we didn't care. It was summertime. We'd been in Texas. It was 100 degrees. We were ready to get up into the mountains. And so we were going to attempt Mount Harvard, a 14er west of BV. The forecast was calling for heavy snow, but that's just a minor detail. It'll all be all right, right? And so we started climbing, and everything was good until we reached about tree line. And the higher we went, the heavier the snow came down, probably over a foot. In about an hour that we had been up there, our boot tracks were getting covered in snow. We had reached the point of a whiteout. We could hardly tell what was up, down, sideways. There was a little rock outcropping next to us. And we got together and we huddled up and we're like, you know what? This is far enough. We need to be able to follow our tracks out of here. So search and rescue didn't have to come get us. And so we turned around, we went back down, and it was kind of a bummer. But this all leads me to thinking about sporting events. You know, sporting events, one of the fun things about sporting events is the home field advantage, the crowd. There's something special having all these people cheering for you, the crowd behind you. It's encouraging, it's a beneficial. You know, we have different nicknames, the 12th man or whatever, the people cheering for the people that are playing on the field. But maybe harder for the opposing team, especially if I'm one of the fans cheering, is hearing the boos. Hearing the criticism from all their failures. It can be difficult to hear those things. It can compound their mistakes. And it makes me think about distance races. You know, it isn't until the end that you hear the crowd. Most of the race is often lonely as the hard work goes unseen by anyone. And you find yourself on those lonely stretches trying to figure out your pace, struggling. Runners are hurting. Will they be able to continue? The pace at some points might start to kill them. And so I was thinking about some ultra marathon we happened across with my family and I last summer. We were out hanging game cams, and I'd tell you where it was, but I can't because I was out there hanging game cams. But these guys were just struggling. I mean, you can die literally in ultramarathon races, and they're just hunched over, and they're looking at their feet, and they're just barely carrying on. Like, I don't know if that person's going to make it. You know, there were like a few of them that looked like they were hurting severely, that they were considering dropping out on the race. No one was there to see them, encourage them, hand them some water, help them out. And this is where the Hebrew church thinks they find themselves. Alone, struggling. No one sees their plight. No one's there to help them. No one's there to encourage them. No one's offered to give them help and assistance. They are trying to run their race, and they're considering dropping out. The entire sermon of Hebrews has been building to this point. But before we read it, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, grow in us today a faith that is dedicated to stay the course during the hardest times in life. I pray that your Spirit would work to give us eyes of faith to see the world through heaven's eyes. Pour through me the gift of preaching that the endurance of Christ may grow in our hearts. I pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen. Now, before I can read these 3 verses for us today, I cannot forget what we read last week. Last week we read about the Hall of Fame of faith, of those who had faith. We learned how we can have faith like these heroes of the Old Testament have faith. If you missed that sermon, you need to go back and listen to it on podcast or on YouTube, because Hebrews is that important. All these people in Hebrews 11, people like Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Rahab, and so many others led us to what we are going to read now, and we only have time for these 3 verses. And trust me, I cut a lot out of what I could say about these 3 verses. But turn with me to Hebrews chapter 4, or chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You know, sometimes we idolize clouds. We like to look at the clouds, with the kids especially, and describe the shapes they make and what images they might look to us like. They seem so soft and fluffy. And that's often how I hear this text preached, idealistically. Like those clouds are as soft as Charmin. And there's just one problem. It's not what the Hebrew church was going through. It's not where they were at. When they were going through their cloud, the cloud probably that they thought of was the cloud over Mount Sinai. When God came down to Moses to give them the law, to establish them as a people, that the mountain itself was burned from God's presence on it. This powerful mountain. No one could step foot on this mountain besides Moses, or they would die. And God was on this mountain. I don't think the picture of this cloud here is like a clear morning on top of a 14,000-foot mountain where you can see for miles. No, I think it's the picture of a lightning storm where you're running to save your life. Life in the clouds can be dangerous. And it gives us a picture of what the Hebrew church was enduring, but a picture of what we're enduring at sometimes. At points in life, we feel like we are lost in the clouds, stumbling on the mountaintop. However, the encouragement in the clouds of life is that we have a great cloud of people. People of faith who have gone before us, cheering us on. Not only the people in Hebrews chapter 11, but the people who are mentors in faith for us. The people who passed faith on to us, who lived this life of faith for us, whose stories we witnessed firsthand as they lived out in faith. Those ones too are in the cloud. They too are cheering us on. And so I want to ask you today, who's in that cloud for you? Who's in your cloud? Who are the ones that come to mind first when you think of who's cheering you on? I think of my grandparents. I think of my late mentor, Mike Myers, and good friend. And you know what? I could tell you word for word everything that they'd say to me, the advice they'd give to me, how they'd react to different situations. I knew them well enough, and I bet you can think of people like that too, that you know exactly what they would say. But there's just one problem. I can't hear it with my own ears. There's no voice to respond back, to say anything. And this reminds me of sports. See, there's this new phenomenon in sports called watch parties. You ever seen this? Whenever there's like a big sporting event, a big game, they get together all of the away team. They get together all their fans, maybe in the stadium where they usually are at, or some different venue, maybe in a house. And when the away team does something really well, we know when we're watching the game that they cut over and they show all of the fans cheering. The away team, they're celebrating, they're hugging, they're cheering each other on. But there's just one problem. The team, the ones participating, the ones playing, they can't hear it. They can believe those people are cheering. They can think, oh man, my wife, my husband, my friends, my parents, my family, they might be cheering this way for me. But they can't see it. They can believe it, but they can't see it. And so they only can hear the boos, the criticism, the put-downs from the opposing team's fans. And the preacher of Hebrews wants us to know that through all the yelling against us, there's actually a greater crowd of those cheering and yelling for us, if only we had the ears and the eyes of faith to hear it. And these cheers, if we have the ears of faith to hear it and the eyes of faith to see it, they cause us to run a certain way. They cause us to run with perseverance, is what we're told here. But in order to have perseverance, first, according to Hebrews chapter 12, we have to do two things. We have to cast off anything that weighs us down. Before I found out it was terrible for my joints, I used to run with ankle weights. I don't know if you've ever run with ankle weights before. It is a terrible experience, right? It was like 5-pound weights on each leg, and it's just weighing you down. When you take those things off, man, you feel like a sprinter. You're moving so quickly. Or consider today in our community, what's the trend? Ultralight. Everything is ultralight. And like these ultra runners have backpacks that are more like a t-shirt, and they have just a few things on them. And they go for these incredibly long runs. I mean, they're like so dedicated, these ultralight backpackers, that they like saw off the handle of their toothbrush to save an ounce. Okay? Like that is commitment, right? Like it's okay if you keep your toothbrush handle. They are committed to throw off everything that weighs them down. Are we that committed in our walk, following Jesus? I mean, what are the things that really weigh us down, that hold us down? I think it's our anxieties. It's our fears, right? It's these trivial things that seem like such a big deal in the moment. You remember what a big deal Y2K was? And then it ended up being nothing. And life is often like that. Right, so that's point number one. The second is to help us overcome and live with perseverance is to cast away the sin which so easily entangles us. Maybe you've heard of these new kinds of endurance races. I often think of the term Tough Mudders, but it's like basically like boot camp for fun, and you're climbing like over all these things and under, and you're jumping off stuff, and you get really dirty, and you take pictures in the mud, and it's a really good time. But you know what? You're a lot faster if you go around those things, right? And so to live with perseverance is to say, there's an obstacle that's really going to slow me down in my journey. Let's avoid that obstacle. In the course of faith, you're allowed to run around those things, okay? You don't have to go through sin and climb over it and jump off. You get to avoid those obstacles. But what is perseverance? As I reflect on perseverance, it sounds like the most un-American thing. I mean, perseverance is awful, right? No one ever has said, I had to persevere that vacation, right? I was just persevering through dessert. Let me tell you, that brownie, it was just so rich, and I had to finish it. And I persevered. No. We only have perseverance when we're struggling. It's our only need for it, when we're having a hard time. And we don't like to struggle in America, right? We like convenience. We're like Burger King, have it your way, right now, right? We like those things, and this, I realize, might be the most countercultural message I could preach, but I'm asking you to have perseverance rather than convenience. And perseverance, according to Hebrews chapter 12, takes a few things. It takes foresight, it takes moral conviction, and it takes strength of will to continue on. And so the rest of the paragraph is meant to teach us these things. It's meant to teach us how to run. Sometimes you think you don't need to learn how to run. Well, guess what? My cross-country coach was pretty helpful in teaching us how to run. We have an excellent cross-country coach in town that teaches people how to run with perseverance and endurance. So if we're going to do that in our faith journey, the person that teaches us to do this, surprise, surprise, if you've been reading with us in Hebrews, is Jesus. Jesus is the one that teaches us how to do this. And throughout the book of Hebrews, Jesus has been described as the pioneer of the faith. In other words, Jesus is the one that went before us. He's the one running in first place, okay? So being a distance runner, especially a good distance runner, is intimidating because you have to know the way of the course. There can't be people at every single spot on the course who are telling you which way to go. You kind of have to know the course and follow the signs, and there's story after story of people taking the wrong path, getting off course, adding miles, or maybe in some cases taking a shortcut during the races. And it's hard when we're in the cloud. It's hard when we're running the race to say, where do I go? What's the next step? Which path do I take in the trail? And the Hebrew preacher is saying, whoa, 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 Jesus went before you. It's okay, follow Jesus. Look at the footprints. Look at the footprints, right? Follow his footprints wherever he is leading for you. And it says that when Jesus ran his race, he ran with foresight. What was the foresight? It was the joy set before him. You want a fascinating thing to think about during communion? What was the joy Jesus was thinking of on that cross? We think of the pain, we think of the suffering. What was the joy? Surely seated at the right hand of the throne of God is the joy, but I think you're the joy. I think you're the one he was thinking of. And so it's hard to live with delayed gratification. We want what feels good now. And all this foresight is what allowed Jesus to endure the shame of the death on a cross. But Jesus knew what was coming. And Jesus had perseverance because Jesus had moral conviction. The conviction to do his Father's work here on earth, to defeat sin, to defeat death. And we are running a race with perseverance because we know there is a better way to live. That there's a way to avoid the obstacles in life. There's a way to run with perseverance, and we have confidence in this because of the way of Jesus. And so finally, running this race takes the strength of will. We have to have some grit. We have to have some determination in following Jesus. And so what do we consider when we need some grit? We consider him who faced such opposition from sinners. That he would face this opposition. That as he was carrying his cross, and as they hung him on there, that they would mock him, that they'd spit on him, that they'd give away his possessions. But he had the moral conviction on the cross to say, forgive them, Father, but they know not what they do. And so it took all of Jesus' strength to persevere, but Jesus did persevere. He did it, and since Jesus did, so can we. We continue on persevering. And this makes me think of, how do we run? How do we run our race of life? This is the call to keep our head up, to keep our eyes up, to fix our eyes on Jesus. Have you ever seen some of those elite runners run? Did you watch any of it in the Olympics? They're not hunched over struggling. No, they're standing tall. They've got their head up. They're looking to the horizon. They're letting their air come in and out. They look like they're just gliding along effortlessly. And you know what? When things are going really well in my spiritual life, that's how I'm running, right? We got our heads up. we're tuned in to Jesus, we're focused to Jesus. It's allowing us to run with perseverance. But I don't know about you, when I tend to struggle, it's when I start looking down at my feet. It's when I start feeling my own hurts and my own pains, and I'm thinking, this is really difficult, Jesus. But I've learned something. Some of my greatest breakthroughs in ministry is when I thought, I'm just going to keep running. We'll see what happens here. Just keep running, just keep pressing ahead. And somehow, at some point, the clouds at life tend to dissipate. You reach the vistas, you get the view, and you see the work that God was doing all along while you were in that cloud suffering. God faithfully takes care of you. And so, this brings me back to one of my favorite ultramarathon athletes. He's been the picture for our theme slide this whole week, Cameron Hanes. I told you about him the first week when I started my series on the book of Hebrews. And he competes and does well all these things called ultramarathon races. And I was listening to a podcast of his where he described one of his best races of all time. It was a 50-mile race, okay? And he talked about how in the first 10 miles, he was struggling. Terrible. Like he could hardly keep going. Cameron Hanes runs almost a marathon a day sometimes. For him to be struggling in the first 10 miles is weird. It's unique. It's awkward. And so he was having all this doubt, this self-doubt of, am I going to have to drop out of this race? Do I need to quit? Am I okay? Am I going to have to suffer the embarrassment of finishing way later in the race than I typically would? And he decided, you know what? He described in this podcast, I'm just going to keep going. And he talked about how after he got out of those 10 miles, he just had this breakthrough. He felt great. He felt awesome. And he started running so quickly. He was feeling so good that he ended up having his best race of all time. That when he thought he was going to give up, when he thought it was over, that he should just quit, it ended up being the best. Spoiler alert, that's what the Hebrew church did. What will we do? And so sometimes in life, it just takes continuing on. It takes having the grit to press on, to stay the course, to keep the faith. And so I have great news of comfort for you all today. We don't need to worry or lose heart because the breakthrough is coming. The crowd is cheering us on. The race is worth running if only we can live with perseverance. So let me take you back to Mount Harvard and what I think of when I see that mountain. The place we turned around in the cloud that day was recognizable. It had a little outcropping that was easy to recognize. And I went back a few years later with some other friends and Aubrey, and we went in and we hiked it. And we summited the mountain, and I looked down. We came from a different drainage, actually, and I saw that rock outcropping about 100 feet or so below me. We were near the top of the mountain, and we didn't know it. We were there. We didn't have any technology back then to tell us, hey, you're almost there, and there's a map. We were right there. If only we could see it, if only we could hear it, if we only had someone yelling, hey, the summit's just right here. Don't quit. Don't give up. And I think there's a metaphor for us there. I think there's some encouragement for us in this lesson, that how many times in our challenges and our difficulties are we just near the top of summiting that obstacle in our life? If only we could press on through the cloud. So this brings me to the substance of the cloud. While the cloud might be scary, and in the cloud we think we can't see, we must remember that in one cloud God led his people. And God is leading us through those clouds. But the people in those clouds, they have something more going on in their life. And so, I don't know if any of you got the chance to watch the Olympics this year, but France had one of the best Olympic performances they've ever had in apparently decades, okay? Now, it still wasn't enough to beat the U.S. We doubled their medal count, but for them, they did good, okay? And the commentators, one after another, talked about it. And they were talking about what they attributed their success to. And every commentator I heard all said the same thing. Home field advantage. They could hear the crowd cheering for them. And hearing the crowd cheering for them spurred them on to work as hard as they possibly could. Maybe you saw this guy, Leon Marchand. I can't say his name right, but Ember, if she was here, probably could. Tell her she missed the wrong week. If you saw this guy swimming, breaking Michael Phelps records, when he'd go underwater, the crowd would be silent. And they'd catch their breath. And as soon as he'd pop his head up, they'd scream. And it was up and down as they were screaming and cheering for him. So all he ever heard when he was out of the water was his home country cheering for him. And he set records doing it for them. But sometimes it's hard when no one's cheering for us. When we don't hear it, when we just have to continue and press on. Living by faith means we're basically always playing on the road. We're always the away team, but there is a crowd cheering us on. We can't see them because we're playing in the arena right now. But one day we will see that this crowd is bigger than any crowd, than any stadium on planet Earth. This cloud is cheering us on. But for now, we have to have faith. We have to have faith that that crowd is cheering for us. And so I think about our cloud of witnesses today. A few weeks ago, Jim Taylor told us about a guy named Larry that built this backdrop here with the rocks and the baptistry behind it and the cross to give us our focus for the center of the auditorium. And he talked about how he was baptized in that after he built that. I wonder how Larry was cheering last week when Jackson was baptized. I imagine he was pretty excited. I've heard so many people tell me that the reason why they attended this church was because of a lady named Georgia. That Georgia was so kind and caring and loving to them, made them feel so welcome that it wasn't anything else. It wasn't how they did church, the theology, the preacher, the songs. It was Georgia. Georgia made them feel at home. Donnie told me this week that he got to be with Georgia as she finished her race. Georgia is now cheering us on. And I can't help but think that Georgia would be saying, man, come on, greet those visitors. Love on them, care, make them feel special, make them feel like they belong, that they are welcome here. When I think about Linda being a great encourager. This lady who you guys didn't maybe get the chance to see, who the girls at Trek would just gravitate towards. They wanted her advice. They would say, Linda, I'm going through this. I'm struggling with this. Will you help me get through these things? And Linda was like their glue, holding them together in those difficult times. And so I think Linda today is shouting, you guys can do it. You can encourage each other. You can keep it going on. You can continue the faith. I think about our elder Jerry. I heard Jerry's voice this week, cleaning out this baptistry. Let me tell you, Jerry told me a story about how they used to leave this baptistry uncovered and how it got filled with dust and how he spent hours scrubbing as hard as he could to clean out this baptistry. And so after Jackson's baptism, if you would have showed up to the church Sunday night and Monday morning, you would have seen me working hard to get all the dust out of there and put the covering that Jerry made back on there so we didn't have to deal with that again. And it's fresh and ready to go for the next baptism. I think about Lucy Butterfield, whose funeral I was going to get to officiate, and then I came down with COVID, and Jerry officiated the funeral for me. I think about her not only starting Patio Pancake, but I learned about that she was the one that took Jim and Judy down to Mexico, that started the Mexico missions, that all the people and the kids down there being fed because of this simple trip they put together. Or I think about Andy Johnson or so many others. How are they cheering us on as we run our race? They now have received their joy, but we still have joy set before us. And so may we be joyful as we run through this cloud, through the wilderness of life. May we know that this cloud is leading us somewhere. And so I hope that we can run with great endurance. As cloudy as it might seem, the race is marked out for us. Jesus went ahead of us, and so we can run like elite ultramarathon runners, because when we run, we follow Jesus. Wherever he steps, wherever he goes, we follow. Will you join me in running this race?